Hi, Steve.
Hey, Bob. Nice to see
Hey.
you.
Nice to see you. Thanks for taking the time to join us. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. I encourage people to subscribe to both. You are Stephen Walt, professor of international affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School, also author of The Hell of Good Intentions, about America's foreign policy elite and why, in your view, they don't deserve their job. They keep making mistakes. You're also fairly famously co-author with John Mearsheimer of the 2007 book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. We'll have occasion to get into that. But I wanted to start out by talking about a piece you recently wrote for Foreign Policy, where you're a columnist, called The Dangerous Decline in Israeli Strategy. The subhead is, for decades, the Zionist project has been getting worse at defending itself. There's a few places we could start with this. We could start at the beginning, where you think Israel first started making strategic mistakes of some magnitude about 60 years ago. But there's a kind of a pretty topical issue that intersects with your argument at a different point. So a couple of days ago, Israel launched a big aerial assault on Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. Israel said it was to preempt a big Hezbollah strike. In any event, Hezbollah responded with hundreds of rockets. That seems to have not escalated and to have returned to whatever stability was before that all happened. But maybe you could start with by talking about a mistake you think Israel made in the 1980s that contributed to, well, the very creation of Hezbollah, and helped shape its character, I guess.
Right. Well, this was the invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which was, I think a classic case of a harebrained scheme, right? The Palestine Liberation Organization had a substantial presence in Lebanon, was still, obviously resisting Israeli efforts to control the West Bank and expand settlements there, etc. And Ariel Sharon came up with this idea that what they ought to do is invade southern Lebanon, scatter the PLO. They were going to actually also engage in sort of local Lebanese politics and get a pro-Israel faction of Christians in power in Beirut. This was going to then completely marginalize the PLO and would give Israel a free hand on the West Bank. Menachem Begin was the prime minister at the time. It wasn't originally his idea, but Sharon convinced him this would all work. And so they launched the invasion, and the invasion went very well in one sense. I mean, they didn't face any substantial opposition at the beginning. They got all the way to Beirut, but the PLO didn't leave. There was this long siege of Beirut. Many Lebanese, of course, were killed. Innocent Lebanese were killed in the process. And eventually the Reagan administration got very upset with this and started putting limits. There were massacres by Christian militias that the Israelis were at least partly complicit in. But the main problem, of course, was that once they got there, they couldn't leave. And Israel ended up occupying southern Lebanon for 18 years. As a result of that occupation, you get the formation of Hezbollah, which didn't exist prior to 1982. A Shiite militia, which gradually gets support from Iran, becomes more formidable. And now, some 40 years later, of course, is a real problem for the Israelis, arguably as serious a problem for them as Hamas is as well. So here you have a case where a strategic decision made back in 1982 led to nothing but trouble for the Israelis. And it's like a classic illustration of how their ability to think strategically and enact policies that will leave the country better off over time has been declining over time.
Okay. And presumably, if Ariel Sharon, he's not alive anymore, is he? If he were alive to hear what you had to say, he might say something like, well, we had to do something. And what would be on his side of that argument? In other words, what was the PLO doing that was problematic from Israel's point of view?
Well, they were refusing to accept that Israel was going to establish full control of the West Bank. I mean, the taproot of all of these problems is back a little bit earlier, back in 1967, after the Six-Day War, when Israel conquers East Jerusalem and the West Bank and the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula, and decides at that point, kind of in a fit of absent-mindedness, but not entirely, that it's going to begin to colonize the West Bank, that it's going to try to control the entire area. And you can understand why they wanted to do that for purely territorial reasons. It gave them greater strategic depth. But unfortunately, it also meant that you had, over time, roughly an equal number of Israeli Jews and a roughly equal number of Palestinian Arabs, all being controlled by the same government. Well, one of the things the original Zionists had wanted was a Jewish state that was predominantly Jewish. They didn't want a large Arab population as part of it. But in 1967 and in the years subsequently, of course, that policy got reversed. And Israel now, of course, controls, again, roughly the same number of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. And that, of course, then led people like Sharon to say, well, we've got to do something about this problem. Maybe what we need to do is invade Lebanon. But they've never come up with an adequate solution for that problem. And we're seeing that play itself out now on a daily basis in Gaza.
Okay. Now, the PLO at that point was very militant, right? I mean, it later became less inclined to use violence as it got drawn into the negotiations and so on. But I assume, I mean, they were staging cross-border raids or something from Lebanon. I mean, they had gotten kind of displaced to Lebanon. Originally, I guess they had been based more in Jordan or something. They wound up in Lebanon, but they were at that point committing acts of violence, right? I assume Sharon would say, well, no state can live with, actors just across the border who keep launching attacks on it, right?
No question. And in fact, the pretext for the invasion of Lebanon was the assassination of, I believe, the Israeli ambassador in London, who was assassinated not by the PLO, actually by another Palestinian faction. One of the things to remember in this period is it's not just the Palestine Liberation Organization and Arafat, but there are other more radical groups. This is before Hamas has emerged, by the way, but it's still a somewhat divided movement, although Arafat's the most important leader within all of those groups. That's the pretext for it. And certainly Israelis had a reason to worry and to be concerned about that. But the problem was in a capacity or incapacity to think beyond trying to address the immediate security problem and figuring out what the long-term political solution is going to be to essentially two sets of people, roughly equal numbers, who both have claims to the same space and are going to have to find some way to either divide it or share it. Right. And unless you're willing to tackle that, you're never going to solve the political problem. And that's what Israeli leaders were unable or unwilling to do, regardless, by the way, of political parties. Right. The settlement enterprise was conducted by labor governments, by Likud governments, by coalition governments as well. It's been across the political horizon ever since the 1970s.
Yeah. Now, it seems to me, and I'm not sure how much you agree with this, but that a big problem with the world, and it's been kind of particularly acute in Israel, is that if the population of a country has any kind of reason to fear anything, the dynamics of political competition, and this is maybe especially true in democracies, will lead some political leaders to try to exploit that and even amplify the fear. And, you see that in the United States. I mean, domestically, you see, Kamala Harris says to fear Trump and Trump says to fear Kamala Harris. And certainly you see lots of politicians saying we need to fear Iran or China or Al Qaeda. And it's not like there's no basis for any of those claims. It's that there are political actors in whose interest it is to actually inflate the threats. And the thing about Israel is there have always been plausible reasons to feel threatened, right? Ever since, because of the nature of the history of Israel. And in fact, of course, the original citizens of Israel go into the whole project having just been through the Holocaust. And so, kind of feeling threatened. And so it seems to me like this is part of the problem. Before we get into other strategic mistakes you think the leaders have made, it seems to me that there's something about the dynamics of public opinion and politics that encouraged mistakes.
Yeah, no, you're the political psychologist here, and but the way you've described it, I think, is a universal tendency. Certainly not unique to Israelis. We saw this dynamic play itself out in the Balkans. We've seen it play itself out after 9/11 here in the United States, after September 11th, where it was very easy to rev up a sense of danger, a sense of threat, even though, in fact, Al-Qaeda did not pose an existential threat to the United States. Certainly, many Americans, good friends of mine, were completely alarmed by what they thought might be happening. And you're right that political leaders sometimes are more than happy to exploit this. Right? I think we're seeing, Netanyahu exploit that now. Here's a guy whose political career is hanging by a thread on October 8th of last year and has managed to in some respects, not redeem himself, but keep himself in power, in part by revving up a sense of existential danger. So I think that has been part of the backdrop of this conflict all along. And of course, that's true on both sides, right? If you're a Palestinian Arab whose family was expelled in 1947-48 as part of the War of Independence, who's then been living under Israeli occupation. Your family fled to the West Bank. You were ruled by Jordan for a while. Now you've been ruled by the Israelis. You've been denied political rights for the last 40 or 50 years or so. You would have, it would be very easy to radicalize you and to say, well, there's no point in trying to deal with the other side. We have to find some way to become as strong as they are and then, punish them or whatever. So I think that's a part of this dynamic. And what you hope for is that either particularly far-sighted leaders, and we have had a few at various points here, or outsiders who might be able to take a more detached view, would be able to try and use their influence and, in some cases, use their power to get, the actual antagonists to resist or to think their way past the immediate sort of intensification of suspicion, intensification of fear. But I think it's a huge problem, and this particular conflict is probably one of the most clear-cut examples of that dynamic at work.
Mm-hmm. Well, America says it's Israel's friend, so surely America will step back, take a detached view, and encourage Israel to do the right thing for Israel, right? I'm not entirely. That's a setup for you to talk about your 2007 book if you want, or say whatever you want. But it's no secret. You think America has kind of abdicated what would be the duty of a true friend to exert some tough love.
Yeah, no, I mean, we all know that our friends are not necessarily being good friends if they just tell us that they'll support us no matter what, and they never tell us when we're doing something wrong. I mean, one of the best things your best friends can do is tell you when you're in a hole and digging and, suggest that maybe you put down the shovel. All right. So we're not being a good friend as individuals, we're not being good friends to the people we care about if we don't tell them the truth when we think they're making a mistake. And unfortunately, I think for largely domestic political reasons, the way American politics works, the United States has not been a particularly good ally to Israel. We've been incredibly supportive. We've given them pretty much whatever they wanted most of the time, regardless of how they have acted. But as a result, that's encouraged Israel to take steps or to do things that haven't made Israel more secure, and I would argue have actually made it less secure over time. And have also encouraged or tolerated some of the most extreme elements in Israeli society, the settler movement, the religious conservatives that are becoming, more numerous and more influential, and I believe are, creating at least the real possibility of Israel essentially becoming a pariah state. As Israel's principal ally, for America to bankroll that and support it and not try to do more to arrest that development seems to me very short-sighted. But being short-sighted is something American politicians are often quite good at.
And it's interesting, come to think of it, how rarely I think American politicians kind of put it this way, say, take issue with our current policy toward Israel and say, I don't even think this is good for Israel, let alone America. I mean, actually, that's two things American politicians rarely say. I mean, let's take the Gaza situation right now. I think it's fair to say you think Israel's policy is not in America's interest and is not in Israel's interest. I mean, certainly at this point, whatever you think about how much initial kind of reprisal after October, was it 7th, was justified or wise. But it seems to me like a pretty easy argument to make in both cases, but you never hear politicians put it that way. And I don't understand what would be so incendiary about putting it that way. I mean, right? I mean, if you're there are a lot of American politicians, I think, in the Democratic Party, who have grave doubts about the wisdom of what's going on in Gaza. And what they generally say is there's too much suffering on both sides. Well, that's not a very pointed, way to put it. And I don't quite understand why, if they perceive there to be great political risk in saying, look, this isn't good for us and it's not even good for Israel, like, why is that something more people can't say?
I think the people to ask are Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, two congressmen who were primaried out and faced millions of dollars of donations from AIPAC and AIPAC-related organizations going to their opponents. So I think that for most politicians, particularly politicians who really don't care one way or the other about the issue themselves, it's just not high on their agenda. For most politicians, the safe thing to do is to talk about the ironclad commitment, to say the United States stands in Israel's corner, and not allow even doubts to surface about that. Now, you have some exceptions in some circumstances. So, famously, a few months ago, Chuck Schumer, whose pro-Israel credentials are of long standing, one of the strongest supporters in the Senate for many, many, many years, does stand up in the Senate floor and gives a speech criticizing not so much Israeli conduct, but Prime Minister Netanyahu. It was very interesting. Right. If you go watch the speech or read it, he's expressing his support for Israel, but he's very critical of Netanyahu. So he wants to pin all the blame on just one person, right? And by doing that, of course, he's trying to suggest, I'm not real happy with this policy, but of course, I'm still a steadfast supporter. All right, the police don't come after me. And of course, Schumer, of course, got severely criticized by the far right in Israel. Mm-hmm. For being essentially a traitor, for turning his back on it. So even Schumer faced some pushback under those circumstances. But I think for most American politicians, even to say what you were suggesting, that this policy isn't good for us and also not good for Israel, is a step they're unwilling to take, because they understand they're going to face a firestorm of criticism, and they could face suddenly organized groups trying to drive them out of office. Let me say one final thing, though, about this. What I find really puzzling is I've yet to see a clear articulation from the Biden administration about why they think their current policy is in America's interest. All right. So you get statements about they want to see a ceasefire, they want to bring peace, or whatever. But I've yet to see, Blinken get up in front of the cameras and say, here's why what we're doing is making Americans safer, is making Americans more prosperous, is making the United States more respected around the world. I'm sure he has a thought in his head, but it's interesting that the administration doesn't make its case on that basis, which seems to me kind of the obvious way you'd want to defend the policy, saying, let's explain to you why sending Israel $18 billion of military aid to sustain its war effort in Gaza. Let me explain to you why that's good for America. I couldn't make that argument myself. I like to think someone in the administration has an idea in their head, but it's striking that they haven't said that out loud that I've detected.
Yeah. I mean, I guess when I was asking why American politicians don't use the formulation I suggested, I mean, I don't know exactly what Cori Bush has said, but it seems to me that the relatively few politicians who are far enough left to go ahead and make big criticisms of Israel's policy tend to do it in kind of moral terms, or in terms of what Palestinians are legitimately entitled to. I don't hear so much them saying it's not in America's interest. And let's assume, I mean, leave that aside. What if they just focused on saying this is not in Israel's interest? You would think it would be hard for AIPAC to get too indignant about somebody saying I have a difference of opinion about what's in Israel's interest. I mean, see, the vibe you get from a lot of critics is, look, I don't give a shit about Israel. This is A, wrong, or B, bad for America, or C, whatever. I just don't hear often the discussion of what's even in Israel's interest, which would seem to me, in some cases, a smart way to put it. If you really wanted to get some people to pay attention to you, but
well, you could try that. But this is not really about me. But I will mention that if people actually read the book we wrote back in 2007. And published it, it defends Israel's right to exist. It condemns anti-Semitism in quite explicit terms. It talks about how we support a two-state solution. We say explicitly in several places in the book that the United States should come to Israel's aid if its survival is in jeopardy. And we say that what we really need is not to get rid of the Israel lobby. What you need is a different Israel lobby. You need organized groups in the United States who are pushing the United States to adopt smarter policies that would be in America's interest and very much in Israel's interest. We said all those things in our book, and it didn't prevent, of course, a firestorm of criticisms and denunciations and smear tactics and whatever. Mm-hmm. And I think part of it is that the groups in like AIPAC and the more hardline members of the lobby, what they want is unconditional American support. They want the United States to back Israel pretty much no matter what it does. And they don't really want to have a wide-ranging discussion of it. They don't want to have a big debate on these issues. They don't want to have people questioning that support. And so, it doesn't matter how nuanced your argument is or whether you frame it in the way you're describing and the way we did in our book, you're going to get criticized anyway because they don't want that conversation to happen. Now, what's occurred, and this I think is a big problem for AIPAC over time, is that, sort of reality has finally penetrated. There is a more open discussion of these issues, like the conversation we're having right now. There are lots of alternative media sources now where people can get information. People can see on their smartphones what's happening in Gaza. It's impossible to hide it entirely. And so, in a sense, it's much harder to shape what people know, what people think, than it was, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And I think that's a real problem for groups that are trying to sustain the argument that this is both, the morally right thing to do, but also in America's interest and also in Israel's interest. It's a long-winded way of saying that I think that these groups are losing the rhetorical battle, gradually, and that's ultimately forcing them to sort of rely on power politics more than the old arguments that used to, persuade people pretty readily 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah. And we should say, I mean, that when you talk about the 2007 book, you're talking about your book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, the one you co-authored with John Mearsheimer. And I guess we should say quickly that when you use the term Israel lobby, you mean more than AIPAC, which is an official lobby. You mean think tanks, pro-Israel donors, Christian evangelicals who are pro-Israel, and various actors
Right.
who aren't necessarily always communicating with each other in strategy, but amount to a force, however amorphous, of some magnitude. I think.
Right. It's an interest group like lots of other interest groups that have many different parts. Those parts don't necessarily agree on every single issue, but they agree on enough things. In the case of the Israel lobby, it's basically the agreement that the United States should have a special relationship of unconditional support for Israel, and that should be maintained. That's what unites all of those groups, even if some of them, support a two-state solution and some of them are opposed, or some of them would have certain attitudes towards the Abraham Accords, and others might think they weren't such a great idea. Whatever.
Right. And one example is the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, an issue on which I think there was not unanimity within the lobby. But AIPAC, when Donald Trump, I mean, first of all, Obama, at some political cost, pushed the nuclear deal through, defying certainly some parts of what you would call the Israel lobby. And then Trump wanted Netanyahu wanted him to get out of it. Trump got out of it. A large number of Israeli elites think what Trump did was a bad idea. A lot of the national security establishment of Israel. And yet AIPAC supported Trump, as you note. Now, is that because AIPAC, just because its official mission is to support whatever the Israeli government says is the policy and Netanyahu was prime minister and this is what he wanted? Or is it because AIPAC is just particularly hardcore?
I think it's a little bit of both. That, AIPAC for years have not wanted there to be a lot of daylight between the Israeli government and themselves. It's also worth remembering that the late Yitzhak Rabin, who was prime minister in the 1990s and eventually assassinated by an Israeli extremist, he didn't have much use for AIPAC. He actually thought AIPAC was a problem because he was trying to work out some kind of political settlement with the Palestinians and was facing pushback from AIPAC. That's one of these places, one of these moments when there was actually some daylight between AIPAC and the Israeli government. I think AIPAC is, pretty far right, along with groups like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which was very outspoken against the Iran nuclear deal. And it's, again, one of these cases where I think, although you're absolutely right, that key members of the Israeli national security elite understood that the nuclear deal, although not perfect, was very much in Israel's interest. The government, led by Netanyahu, was adamantly opposed. Netanyahu had long seen Iran as, the main bogeyman that they had to worry about. I think a good case can be made that he has wanted to get the United States into a more direct confrontation, including possibly a military confrontation with Iran for a long time. And again, this to me is an example of just sort of short-sighted strategic thinking on the Israeli part. It's understandable that Israel wants to preserve a nuclear monopoly in the Middle East as the only country there with nuclear weapons. But the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, was a step in the right direction, certainly delaying any possibility of an Iranian nuclear weapon. And therefore, it was in Israel's interest, which I think the Obama administration understood, but some key groups, the most important groups in the lobby, didn't understand, and they were eventually able to convince Donald Trump to take a fateful step, which unfortunately has caused Iran to restart its nuclear program and get closer to having a bomb than ever before.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, whose assassination kind of paved the way for Netanyahu's whole career in a way. It's as I recall, this is just a footnote, but his widow intimated that she held Netanyahu partly responsible for the assassination. She didn't mean that he had ordered it or was part of a conspiracy, but Netanyahu had been doing what I was alluding to earlier, which is depicting a political opponent as a threat to the nation and, whether intentionally or not, aiding and abetting the enemies of the nation and so on. And that was the environment in which some settler fanatic assassinated Rabin.
That's correct. And I mean, Netanyahu's political career has really been based, I think, if there's a thread that runs throughout it from the very beginning, it's a complete, adamant, total opposition to a Palestinian state. As far as he's concerned, that should never come into being. He has never spoken in support of it, except once when he very briefly, under American pressure, talked about, I think used the phrase Palestinian state, but what he meant was not a state. He meant a few isolated little communities that Israel would completely control. And that was his opposition in the 1990s. That's why he was speaking out against Rabin. And it is part of that. And again, this is, in my view, an example of short-sighted strategic thinking. A key objection or key objective in that was to keep the Palestinians divided. You never wanted to have an effective Palestinian leadership. You never wanted to have a legitimate Palestinian government. You didn't want it to be competent. You didn't want it to be unified. That was a population and a political movement that might actually have a really powerful and credible claim to a state. What you wanted to do was keep incompetent people in charge of key Palestinian institutions and keep the Palestinians deeply divided. So one of the things Israelis have done at various times is actually provide support to Hamas, not because they like Hamas, but because Hamas is a rival of the Palestinian Authority, and that keeps the Palestinians divided as well. And because Hamas is extreme, it makes it very easy to depict the Palestinian movement as extremists, innately violent, congenital aggressors, etc. Of course, the consequence of that is that you never get a solution to the fundamental political problem. Again, the coexistence of roughly the same number of people in the same place, with both with claims to the land. And eventually, of course, you have events, tragedies like October 7th, which is, this is why Netanyahu was in such trouble, as it became clear that he had been tacitly supporting Hamas, and suddenly Hamas inflicts this horrific attack on Israel, which doesn't exactly make him look like a strategic genius as well. But that's been the central theme of Netanyahu's entire career. And unfortunately, it's taken Israel from, I think, a much more favorable position, which he was in the 1990s, to the situation you see now, where he's being investigated for war crimes by the International Criminal Court. Israel is increasingly seen as a pariah state. It has an unwinnable war it's waging in Gaza. It's got a border conflict with Hezbollah. It faces other problems, which I could name as well. And I think that's all been a consequence of failing to deal with the fundamental political problem and thinking you could solve it with short-term tactical moves that almost always involve violence.
Yeah, I mean, there's maybe a more precise analogy you could draw between kind of Hezbollah and Lebanon on the one hand and Gaza and Hamas on the other that maybe illustrates what you just said. I'm not sure if you buy it, but it seems to me, I mean, if you look at this idea that Netanyahu set out with to eliminate Hamas, I mean, everyone agrees that hasn't happened. And it has perhaps succeeded in giving him an excuse to keep the war going so long that he's still prime minister. But most people seem to think you're never going to eliminate Hamas. If you did somehow erase the brand of Hamas, you would probably get some other militant organization that was equally problematic for Israel to arise in the ashes of Gaza. And the analogy I'm thinking of is that the invasion of Hezbollah, it seems like, represented this idea that, okay, you had the PLO, which some would call a militant manifestation of the Palestinian resistance to occupation, to the way they're being treated, okay? You've got the discontent among Palestinians with the treatment, and then you get this militant manifestation. Israel tried to deal just directly with the militant manifestation, just kill the militants. And it seems to me that in Gaza, you've got basically the same thing. Hamas is a militant manifestation of a sentiment that's widespread among the people in Gaza, which is extreme discontent with the way they've been treated, right? So it's do you agree these are fundamentally the same approach?
Yeah, well, and this is a movie that, or this is a phenomenon we've seen in many other contexts. right? Nationalism and powerful forms of local identity are extremely important in the modern world. It's probably the most powerful political force in the world, a sense of, collective shared identity. Being part of a particular nation, being part of a particular community. And this is what the United States faced when we go into Iraq. We think we're showing up as liberators, and we discover that the Iraqis actually don't like taking orders from the 82nd Airborne. They don't like suddenly having no say at all. And they don't like the fact that we're, of course, imposing various changes on the way they do business. And it's not to say that they wanted Saddam Hussein back necessarily, but they didn't want to take orders from a bunch of Americans. And that was true in Afghanistan, and that's true, for the Russians in Ukraine. The Russians are discovering that Ukrainians do not want to have to take orders from Moscow. This is why, the European colonial empires eventually fell apart. And the Israeli experience is not dissimilar to that, right? That this is a country that could not be created without dispossessing the local population. In 1947-48, when Israel was founded, Jews were 35% of the population of Palestine, and Arabs were the remaining 65% or so. So you can understand why Palestinians were upset by this, and it took 40 years, more or less, for the Palestinians to accept that they were not going to get rid of Israel. Israel was going to be there. And the PLO did that when they signed the Oslo Accords in 1993. What they thought was that, okay, it's not going to be a 50-50 split. We're going to end up with, maybe 22% of original Palestine, but that'd be fine. Just give us a state of our own and we'll take it from there. And Israel's never been willing to go there. Even Rabin, by the way, who was, I think, very farsighted and saw where a lot of this was going and genuinely wanted to reach a political settlement, he didn't talk about a Palestinian state. He talked about something, almost a state. They weren't quite willing to get there. I think subsequent Israeli leaders were willing to talk about it. Ehud Barak, most famously. The offer he made at the famous Camp David summit in 2000 was not a viable state, but it got closer. So there have been moments where we might have actually achieved a real political solution if people had been willing to go a little bit farther. And notice that means that the Israelis would have had to reverse the phenomenon you were talking about before, about this tendency to exacerbate or to exaggerate dangers. What Israelis had to achieve, and you could argue this had to be achieved on the Palestinian side too, was an acknowledgement that both sides would be better off if they had competent and legitimate governments. That in fact, Winston Churchill says in his history of the Second World War, that in victory, magnanimity. I mean, basically by the 1990s, the Israelis had won. Their state was established, it was prosperous, it had nuclear weapons, it had military superiority in the region, it has peace with Egypt, peace with Jordan, right? Syria is not a serious problem for the Israelis anymore. The Soviet Union is gone, so the Arabs don't have a great power ally to help them. The Israelis have won. And in victory, they needed to be generous. They needed to be generous and say, the only problem we have left is the Palestinian problem, and what they need is a state. And we want that state run by legitimate, popular, highly competent people who aren't interested in going to war anymore. And instead, what the Israelis did was they kept building settlements and they did everything they possibly could to keep the Palestinians weak and divided, as a result of which they have faced violent movements doing the only thing that's left to them, right, which is to try and resist. It's by the way, worth remembering that the UN Charter explicitly says that, I'm sorry, not the UN Charter, international law explicitly says that that populations under belligerent resistance have the right, belligerent occupation have the right to resist. How they resist matters, right? So they can't commit war crimes in resisting, which is why what Hamas did on October 7th was wrong, right? But it's not like they have no right to resist as well. And I think Americans often forget that what, Palestinian resistance is completely legitimate, provided it follows the laws of war.
Okay, so in the 90s, like after the Oslo Accords, of course, Israel has its side of the story about, the Palestinians not delivering on X, Y, and Z, or sporadic violence continuing or whatever. And of course, one problem, once you get into any kind of tit for tat situation, given what we've said about how easy it is to convince your population that you're in the right and the other side's in the wrong, once you get this ongoing retaliatory cycle, it just seems to me like, things get kind of bleak. And I guess you had a little of that, I guess, in the 90s, but
Well,
that, I mean,
to be clear, you had more than a little of that in the 90s. This was a
yeah.
serious problem. I mean, there were, suicide bombings on buses. And one of the other dilemmas in this whole very sad story has been the ability of spoilers, extremists on both sides,
Mhm.
to derail efforts. So the assassination of Rabin obviously derails the Israeli side. It removes the leader who had the most legitimacy for moving in that direction. And similarly, the acts by Hamas and Islamic Jihad bombing buses in Israel, of course, discredits the Israeli peace camp substantially and strengthens, of course, the Israeli right and helps bring Netanyahu to power as well. So the ability of spoilers on both ends and both sides has been a real problem throughout.
Yeah, and it means the extremists are actually playing a non-zero sum game with each other. The extremists on both sides. I mean, Hamas and Netanyahu are de facto allies, right? Because they keep each other in business. And that's the way of the world, I guess. But so a question is now you kind of begin your list of his big Israeli mistakes with the immediate aftermath of the 1967 war, when suddenly Israel was in possession of the West Bank and Gaza, and at that point, Sinai, and I guess the Golan Heights too. And you think the decision to build settlements was the big, pretty close to the original sin, I guess. What do you have a clear idea of? I read Gershom Gornberg's book, The Accidental Empire, a long time ago,
Right.
and I'm not even sure I read all of it, but he depicts it as not that much of a planned thing. I mean, and, it's just kind of like one thing followed the other, and before you know it, you've got tons of settlements. Do you have a view on like the decision to authorize the very first settlement, and then to follow up, and how all that unfolded?
Yeah, well, there's many strands to this story, and I'm not fully conversant in all of it. Like you, I read these books a while back and haven't gone back to them in a while. But yes, I don't think there was a master plan here that somebody had in a drawer saying, if we get the opportunity, this is what we're going to do. So it begins in a kind of fit of absent-mindedness. There are some people who are interested in doing this very early on. And they start, and the government's got lots of other things going on, and it's a small number of people. And there was, I think, very much an expectation in Israel after the Six-Day War that having won this smashing victory, that the line that Israelis would use is that we thought the phone was going to ring, that the Arabs were going to call up and say, "Okay, fine, enough already. Let's settle this whole thing." And again, this is also in a period where it's important to remember that the Palestinian movement, the PLO, it's still a very fragmented organization, and it's very much influenced by the other Arab states who are using it for their own reasons. Right? The Palestinians have been betrayed by just about everyone. Right? The Europeans, their fellow Arabs, by us, obviously by the Israelis as well. So in this period, right, the Arab governments are still jockeying for position with each other, and they're using different factions in the Palestinian movement to try and do that. So even if the phone had rung and it had been a bunch of Arab governments on the line, it's not clear that would have helped the Palestinian situation. Right,
Mhm.
it's not clear, and it's worth remembering that Sadat, when he makes peace with Israel in the late 1970s, right, he tries to get an agreement for the Palestinians as well, But when he has to choose between getting a peace deal for Egypt and getting the Sinai back and getting a deal for the Palestinians, he does what's good for Egypt, right? He gets his territory back and sells them down the river again. Anyway, what I'm suggesting is that the Israelis, thought that there might be a discussion of this. Maybe it'll go back to Jordan. Maybe it'll be demilitarized. But by the 1970s, right, you have a lot of Israelis understanding that this is strategic depth. It provides them with greater security. They've now begun to put military installations in various places. And again, you can completely understand why they did that. Given the history of the country, they didn't know that the Arab states were eventually going to make peace as well. So you have a kind of coalition of some of them as the settler movement, people who believe for religious reasons that Jews should control all of Greater Israel. The Likud party coming to power in the 1970s, and they were always in favor of Greater Israel as well. And then finally, the Israeli military, who saw it as a strategic asset to have this sort of depth. So I don't think it's hard to explain how this process happened without anybody thinking all that clearly about where it might ultimately lead. And I think that may have been that the Israelis were in a funny way dismissing Palestinian nationalism. That they sort of assumed that, well, eventually they'll just go away, or they'll accept permanent subjugation. I'm not sure this was ever really reasoned through very carefully by the Israeli elite.
Yeah, well, I think it's gotten harder since then for various reasons, including technological ones, for problems like that to go away. And I would say in general, I think it would have taken particularly far-sighted leadership to avoid the pitfalls you're saying should have been avoided, and it would have taken courageous leadership in the sense that you would have to tamp down popular fears rather than exploit them. So it wouldn't have been easy, but I would also say, if I recall Gershom Gorenberg's book correctly, right after the conquest of 1967, they consulted with the foreign minister's legal authority, like head lawyer in the foreign ministry, about the building of settlements. And as I recall, he said, no, this would be a violation of international law. So that they knew, and it proceeded anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there's an element of hubris in this story too. By the way, just a little footnote there. David Ben-Gurion, the founding prime minister of Israel, was still alive at the time of the Six-Day War, and he actually gave a famous speech where he warned against sort of succumbing to hubris. That we should not immediately see this victory as the opportunity to then and expand. I think he understood at some sort of intuitive level that this was going to lead to nothing but trouble. That at the end of the day, Israel was still a very small state, still surrounded by at least potentially hostile countries, and that therefore had to calculate very carefully, and very importantly, could not incorporate a roughly equal population of Palestinian Arabs and remain both Jewish and democratic, right? You couldn't square that particular circle because nobody saw exactly where this was headed at that time. I think people didn't sort of think far enough down the road. And what may have contributed to this is a certain sense of what a miraculous story this whole saga has been from the beginning of the Zionist movement. Right? If you sort of think about the original idea, let's start a Jewish state, let's establish a Jewish state in Palestine. Thinking of that idea in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900, this is a crazy idea. It must have sounded like an impossible dream, and yet it came true. right? And one of the points I made in the foreign policy piece that we started with was that it was in part because the original Zionists and people like David Ben-Gurion were extremely shrewd, extremely smart. They were very ruthless, careful strategists who thought very carefully and understood what they were trying to do was going to be really hard, and they had to be really smart about it as well. Well, they pulled it off. And by 1967, they win this stunning victory. Seems like a miracle, right? It would take extraordinary political leaders not to succumb to a sense of almost omnipotence. You know, we can do anything. We don't have to worry about it. This, you know, given this history, maybe God is on our side, etc. They are not the only country, of course, that has had that problem. I'd argue that's been a problem for us, you know, after the end of the Cold War, where we suddenly imagined we could.
I was about to bring that up in NATO expansion and a lot of other things.
Yeah. Right. So it's not unique to Israel, but I think that may be part of the saga as well. You know, people have been telling us we couldn't do these things for a long time, and we're still here. But I think it, you know, again, given if you look at the condition that Israel is in today and the political divisions within Israel that are, I think, you know, as much a threat to its future as anything else, all of those things, you know, are in some sense the consequence of both hubris and failure to think carefully about strategic choices.
Well, listen, we've been talking for a while, and we're going to keep talking, but we've reached the point in the conversation where, after a brief public service announcement, we're going to move into overtime, which is available to Nonzero members. If you want to become one of those, just Google Nonzero and Substack. It's easy to do. And then there's a bunch of kind of, I guess, premium content is the term that will be available to you. Steve's been kind enough to agree to stick around and talk some more. Before we go into overtime, I want to give you a chance to say anything you want about other things of yours you'd like people to read. And I also want to do a little more self-promotion myself. You had mentioned the deal made at the offer made at Camp David for, well, it's often described as a Palestinian state. You were questioning that characterization. If people want a brief take on that I wrote, I mean, like decades ago, like not long after it happened in Slate, called "Was Arafat the Problem?" If you Google "Was Arafat the Problem?" and Slate, you'll see how some of the issues that Steve might mention. And then much more recently, we had a piece in Nonzero called "The Truth About Hamas," which is about one of, I would say, various possible opportunities we had to cultivate a more moderate part of Hamas. This was during the Bush administration. And the Bush administration, I would say, is at least as guilty as Israel was of moving things in quite a different direction. This is right after the Hamas election. Okay, so with that said, Steve, you know, again, you're a columnist of foreign policy, so you always you have a ton of things there. One is called "The Two Biggest Global Trends Are at War." That seems worth reading. You've got a piece about why you shouldn't pay too much attention to party platforms and foreign policy and so on. What other stuff of yours do you encourage people to check out?
Oh, well, I do think the book, The Hell of Good Intentions, which was published in 2018, is still of some relevance. And, you know, it's basically trying to explain what some people have called the foreign policy blob and the set of ideas that has animated American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. I think largely to no good results. And I think it's still relevant because we're now asking the question of, you know, what will happen if the election goes different ways in November. And so let's imagine for a moment that Kamala Harris ends up being the next president. To what extent is she likely to deviate from what have been the positions of the Biden administration? And I would argue, with one or two exceptions, mostly things involving trade policy and things like that, the Biden administration has been firmly in the sort of mainstream orthodox. The United States has to exercise global leadership, has to be involved in almost all global problems. Yes, we have to do more in Asia, but we have to keep doing lots in Europe. And of course, we can't leave the Middle East, and there's lots of other problems to worry about, et cetera. And that she's going to stick with that because that's what the bulk of the foreign policy establishment still wants. Trump is a more interesting option here, but we've seen once at least one Trump term where, with the exception of trade policy, he really wasn't able to shift the needle all that much. And that's partly due to his qualities, partly due to the fact that he had to rely on a lot of people from the establishment, people like John Bolton and others. So there's a real question of whether or not, if Trump gets a second chance, he will have learned from the first experience and would try to do things differently. My own view is that even there, he would face an uphill fight to really move the ship of state in a radically different direction. Just speaking personally, I hope we don't test that latter hypothesis.
So Donald Trump can't count on your support, you're telling us?
Donald Trump cannot count on my support. I actually like American democracy, and I like the Constitution, and I don't think he does.
Okay. So I want to keep talking about this stuff in overtime. I may give you a little pushback. I'm probably grasping at straws, but I think I see a few more rays of hope about the foreign policy of a Kamala Harris administration. And I also want to get maybe a candid take for you about, relatedly, about Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, if I can extract that from you. And if I can't, then I'd be happy to provide one myself. And I want to ask you about kind of a realist take on Gaza. Why, you're identified as a realist. There's been a certain amount of discussion, including in a podcast I did with Emma Ashford recently, about a realist take on what's going on now. So anyway, we'll talk about all that in overtime. You can get there by becoming a paid subscriber to the Nonzero newsletter, which I, of course, encourage. But whether or not you're going to follow us into overtime, thank you for listening this far.